Hello, I'm Lisa Lowe-Vaudran. I'm a senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies, and I'm going to talk about the outcomes of the elections in Mozambique on the 15th of October. We saw the final results announced at the end of last week. The outgoing president, Filipe Nyusi, won with a large, overwhelming majority of 73%. And Renamo's leader, Usufo Mamade, got on the final count 21.8%, so close to 22%, and David Simango of the MDM 4.38%, so just over 4%. The fourth candidate, Albino, got only less than 1% of the votes. So overwhelming victory for Filipe Nyusi, even more than he got in 2014 when he was first elected. In fact, he got 1.8 million more votes. There were 13 million voters during these elections. Frelimo, the ruling party, also increased its seats in Parliament to 184 seats, and Renamo actually dropped in the number of seats. Significantly, though, when it comes to the provincial elections, contrary to expectations, Frelimo won all 10 of the provincial assemblies, which means that Frelimo will then be able to appoint as well the various governors in the country. And this has been one of the main issues around these elections, because before, especially in 2014, Renamo actually won the majority in 3 provinces and came very close in Nampula as well. So it won in 2014 in Zambezi, Tete, and Sofala province, but it was very unhappy because, according to the electoral laws, the central government then appoints the governor of the provinces. But through many, many rounds of negotiations, the electoral laws were then changed earlier this year so that the winning party in a province could get the majority. So obviously this is a big disappointment for Renamo, and the party met and rejected the results and are claiming massive fraud during these polls. Independent observers on the ground in Mozambique are basically speaking about 3 issues of misconduct or criticism of the electoral process. Basically, the first one that everybody has raised is the fact of the registration process, which went awry in many places, but in Gaza province there was actually proof, one could say, of the the National Electoral Commission registering close to 300,000 more voters than the 2017 census said there are adult citizens in that province. So it was in contradiction to the census, and also it was clearly more than 100% of what the target was. And because Gaza province is traditionally favorable to Frelimo, even before the start of the vote, there was this accusation that Frelimo is trying to manipulate the votes in order to stay in power. So that was the first issue, is the registration. There were criticisms that, for example, in Zambezi, where Renamo is popular, there were fewer voters registered. So there was manipulation, an accusation of manipulation of those results. The second thing is about the actual voting day. Accusations of ballot box stuffing and other irregularities. The third issue is the refusal or the inability, the delays in accrediting around 3,000 local observers, which the civil society organizations in Mozambique are very unhappy about, and the opposition. And then finally, the way that the Electoral Commission and also the technical authority that runs the election has been politicized. And we saw that the final count of the Electoral Commission was approved by only 9 of the electoral commissioners and 8 against, which obviously they are representatives of the opposition. So that was very close. And in some of the recommendations, it is said that Mozambique should rather consider looking at a professional electoral management body instead of it being so politicized, because that sort of also casts a shadow over the process. But it has to be said that that is one of the things that Renamo actually asked for, is for party representation on all levels of the electoral management bodies. So there are major issues that independent organizations on the ground have raised during this process. But importantly, as we know, elections in Africa often are a terrain of contestation when it comes to international observers, and especially African observers. So for us, I thought it would be interesting to look at these various observation missions and their conclusions over the elections. Because Renamo has already rejected the results. We're not sure how the process is going forward now. We know, of course, there's a breakaway faction from Renamo who have started to launch attacks, start the violence again. A faction that refuses to disarm. So the process is in the hands of the courts, but the outcome of these elections also cast a shadow over the 6 August big peace deal between Renamo and the government. So the election observers, mainly, of course, the European Union was very critical of violence, intimidation during the elections. Even more critical of the elections were the United States Observer Mission, who, for example, noted serious irregularities during voting day, transfer of voters from the districts, from polling stations to the districts, the tabulation, etc. For example, the United States statement says that during the day there were hardly any voters in Gaza at some polling stations, and in the end there were almost 100% voters, and all in favor of Frelimo. So right, the ghost voters that we were talking about were actually voting according to these statements. But notably, the African observer missions were SADC and the African Union. I think many people tend to just dismiss their observer statements, because generally when there's a press release, SADC and the AU says it was peaceful and well managed, although these are preliminary statements. But I think if you look closely to especially the African Union Commission's report of the observer mission, it is interesting that they raise many serious issues around the context of the elections, especially the violence in the run-up to the vote. The African Union Observer Mission was run by the former Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan. And I will just read what it says in terms of the context of the elections. And so the findings of the Electoral Commission is that the elections in Mozambique took place in a generally challenging political and security environment. Within a context of the emerging insurgency in Cabo Delgado that we all know, but that the government often doesn't name as an emerging insurgency, and the ongoing peace process between the government and Renamo. And then the observer mission also talks about the outbreak of the worst tropical cyclones that Africa has known. So the key findings are the African Union continues to say it was characterized by political tension, particularly during the campaigns. There were reports of incidents of harassment, restriction of movement of political opponents, and the killing of the head of a local observer group. Despite these notable challenges, the elections were conducted on time and in a generally peaceful environment on election day. So, I mean, if one goes into more detail of what the AU actually says, it is quite interesting that, for example, in its recommendations to the government, it notes something that the SADC Observer Mission and even some of the others have noted: the misuse of public funds during the election campaigns, which is something that we saw and that were noted by other observers here at the ISS when we looked at the run-up to the elections. So this is a preliminary statement of the African Union. It makes recommendations that the government of Mozambique should strengthen the peace process, limit the misuse of state resources during campaigns, especially by incumbent candidates. It's important that this is the African Union speaking here. Another issue which was raised both by SADC and the African Union, which I found interesting, is their praise of Mozambique's decision to allow diaspora voters. And SADC, for example, said that this is in line with the revised SADC principles on elections. The African Union says this is also in line with the African Union Charter on Democracy and Elections. And so when we look at other elections in the region, for example, in Zimbabwe, where the diaspora is not allowed to vote, one could then use this and say, well, the African Union and SADC encourages this diaspora vote. So why is it not that elsewhere? We just had voting in Botswana, for example, and there as well, the diaspora is very small, but they were allowed to vote. So my argument is that it is true in many instances, civil society on the continent and especially in the SADC region feel that these observer missions are a waste of time because they basically just rubber stamp and never note any of the irregularities or the problems going forward. But when one really looks at the details of these election missions, and the final reports completely escapes anybody's attention because then the elections are long past, I think it is important to note, and for civil society organizations could then say, well, this is what the African Union has said in previous elections or in elections in other countries. Let us hold our own leadership and the electoral management bodies to account. Just one last point, for example, on voter registration. In Mozambique, as in many countries, every single election there's a new voters roll, and so as I said, in this case there was a lot of dispute around that voters roll. So what the SADC observers recommend is a continuous voter registration. Which is the case in South Africa. You don't have to go and register every single time, but that there is a continuum from one election to the other, which saves money and could also iron out some of the problems. Of course, logistically, in some countries, it's not possible. But there was a request for the voters' roll in Mozambique to be audited, which has happened elsewhere. But it was refused. The Electoral Commission said it's too late. This was early September when these irregularities were noted. So there was another observer mission by ISA, the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa, led by former Ghanaian President Mahama, which also looked at the accreditation observers and also noted something around party funding, which came very late and which is very important. So looking at all these observer missions together, I think there are best practices that one could note in these elections. So maybe finally, just looking forward, what does this now mean for Mozambique? Renamo, as I said, made a strong statement, actually just after the votes were first released, after the 15th, saying that this politicization of the security environment in Mozambique now puts into question the whole 6 August agreement. A latest official statement by the Renamo chair, Mumade, didn't speak of the 6 August agreement, which is perhaps significant. I mean, we'll see how this pans out. I'm sure there are lots of discussions behind the scenes in order for the agreement to stick, because, as I said, there's a breakaway. Going forward, all eyes are, of course, on Cabo Delgado, the north of the country. We've had lots of reports of Russian involvement. President Nyusi actually, while all this drama around the elections going on, flew off to Russia to the Sochi summit. And there are agreements and a lot of speculation around exactly what aid Russia is giving Mozambique in order to fight this insurgency. But of course, in Cabo Delgado, there's the liquid natural gas deals. In the beginning of October, President Nyusi again spoke of this, made big announcements about the $50 billion projects that are now being signed. Investors from around the world, especially from South Africa, including South Africa, are now in a race against time to get their foot in the door in terms of projects around that area, in Pemba and the whole of Cabo Delgado, where the ports and warehouses, etc., are investor missions are going up there. So there's excitement around the expected boom around the gas projects and also the gemstones and so on. But for this, Mozambique, of course, needs political stability. The government certainly doesn't need mass protests in the streets, and it wouldn't want to see the end of the peace agreement, which was the third peace agreement between the government and Renamo, and that this dispute around the elections should be resolved peacefully.